Hello, humans. This is the next in my series of case studies, and it involves an herb I like a lot, Cāngzhú, which is a type of attractive lotus. And this is a case from Xǔ Shūwēi, who was a Song Dynasty doctor. Um, yeah. So he wrote a bunch of books. He was a Jingfang practitioner. He loved Zhang Zhongjing and Shanghan Lun and Jingui Yaolei, and he wrote about them a lot. But at the same time, in his books, he sometimes did things that had little to do with, classical formulas and so forth. So anyway, he wrote a book called Puji Buncher Fang, not to be confused with Puji Fang. Which is another important book that was written later. This isn't like a huge book. In the Song Dynasty, they didn't usually write huge books because printing, I guess, was more difficult or more expensive. Anyway, this book was published in 1132, which is the Southern Song Dynasty, and you can see his dates here, 1079 to 1154. And Xu Shūwēi was also called Scholar Xu because I guess he was very studious, and we will see evidence of that in this particular case. So here he's talking about his own case. He's not talking about treating somebody else. He's talking about himself. He said, all my life I've suffered from two different diseases. One was bloody stool. The other was rheum collecting in my chest. So on the next slide, I'll talk more about what is rheum. But these are like bad fluids collecting in his chest. The bloody stool would be off and on, it would stop at times, but the rheum that was collecting in his chest never stopped. I started experiencing this symptom when I was young. And here's what happened. He would sit up late in the night writing and studying and being scholar Xu. But while he had bad posture, I guess he'd lean on his left arm over the desk while he's writing with his right hand. So he would lean to the left over his desk, and that means that whatever he ate or drank tipped to the left side of his body. At least that's his perception. So after midnight, he's up like all night, burning the lamp oil. And after midnight, when he got tired and was ready to go to bed, he would drink 2 or 3 cups of wine. Becomes obvious later in this story that he's talking about wine, and then go to bed. It'd help him slow down and sleep, I guess. But he also slept on his left side. So he's leaning to the left while he's writing. He's sleeping on his left side. But he was young then. He said my chi was strong at the time. So I didn't notice anything special going on. So let's talk about this room. I know some of you know what it is, but just in case, the character for that is yin, not to be confused with yin and yang. It's a different character, it's a different tone. And this word literally means drinks, to drink, a beverage, that kind of stuff. And so it's kind of surprising then that room actually means drinks, but the image we get is that ancient people thought that drinks could accumulate and not be processed and become turbid and hang out and slosh around and make problems. And room was talked about in, Shanghanlun and Jingui Yaolei. This is an ancient, problem. Today, we don't talk about room so much, although occasionally it'll come up in a modern text. More often, we talk about phlegm and dampness, meaning internal dampness. So back then, when they said damp, they really, for the most part, meant external weather dampness, like humidity, and internal dampness they'd call room. As far as I can tell, is pretty equivalent to internal dampness and other problems with fluid metabolism and so forth. Mm, In ancient times, they rarely talked about phlegm. In, Zhang Zhongjing's writings, there were four types of rheum, and one of them was phlegm rheum. But their phlegm was an adjective to describe what type of rheum it was. Phlegm wasn't like an independent idea. And in books in the Song Dynasty, they just almost never mentioned phlegm. Phlegm became more commonly discussed in the Yuan dynasty and afterwards, and it became, a big deal in the Ming and Qing dynasties. So phlegm isn't generally an ancient diagnosis. But anyway, this is rheum, which is like from what you drink, doesn't get properly processed, so it accumulates and gets gross. It's kind of like the idea of food stagnation, except it's drink stagnation. And so anything that stagnates becomes turbid. And so generally today, if you come across the word rheum, it means thin pathological fluids, whereas phlegm is thicker pathological fluids. And so what he's saying is that the wine he was drinking became rheum because he was leaning to the left and sleeping on the left and, not moving around enough and this kind of stuff. Okay. So, that started when he was relatively young and strong, but 3 years later or 5 years later, after this happening for a long time, he started to feel that the wine was being retained in his body and it was seeping down the left side with trickling sounds, gurgling sounds, and ribside pain on the left side, the side he was leaning towards. And so he was eating and drinking less because of this discomfort. And he would vomit several sheng of sour, bitter fluids every 10 days or so. How big is a sheng? It's changed over different time periods, but several sheng, he's vomiting a fair amount. In the summer, only the right side of his body would sweat. It's hot out, so you sweat in the summer. But the right side would constantly drip moisture. On the other hand, the affected side, which was on the left, the affected site on the left, was dry and didn't sweat at all. So he had, some strange stuff going on in his body. He visited famous doctors all over and he took formulas wherever he could find them. He tried everything and anything, but nothing was very effective. Occasionally, the medicine struck the disease, meaning it had effect, but he would relapse after a month or so. Nothing had long-term effect. So these various doctors, they supplemented me with herbs like tianxiong, fuzi, and fanshi. So these are not herbs that we would really call supplementation today, but tianxiong is a type of aconite, and fuzi is, of course, the most commonly used type of aconite. And fanshi is alum, which is some kind of mineral. These are extreme herbs. Minerals are generally almost always extreme, and aconite, of course, is extremely hot, potent, and has toxicity. They also disinhibited me with herbs like qianyu, gansui, and daji. So these are herbs that induce a drastic descending movement so that urine and stool just pours out from below really violently. People are trying to get all of this extra fluids, this rheum out of the body by pushing it down really violently. He tried them all. So these are herbs, the herbs that he's mentioning are not commonly used today internally, with the exception of fuzi. And that's still used cautiously because it has toxicity. So he's saying he tried everything, even really drastic stuff. So sorry for the little pause. Okay. So um, here is what the conclusion he came to after not being able to be successfully treated. He said that his condition of this room, these fluids in his body, was like rainwater stuck in a shallow pit. So imagine a puddle of rainwater. Um, it's just there and stagnant and dirty. So if the pit doesn't overflow, the water doesn't move, it just stays there still and stagnant. If the pit overflows, maybe there's more rain, the water moves, but only the clear can move while the turbid continues to accumulate, just like before. What's going to spill? So turbid stuff is heavy and will sink down. Clear stuff is light and floats to the top. So if it rains more and this overflows, the muddy turbid stuff will still be in the bottom of the pit, and it's the like cleaner stuff that will overflow. Um, so these fluids inside of him have no pathway out below. He couldn't, he tried all these drastic things that induced urination and stool, and the fluids just wouldn't leave that way. There was no pathway out below. So because of this, the turbid accumulated for 5 or 7 days, and then he'd vomit. And this would relieve it for several days, but then the same thing would happen again as the turbid would just accumulate in the puddle. And that's his description, that's his perception of the disease. So, further explanation. He says spleen is earth element, and of course, spleen dislikes dampness, and rheum is very much related to damp. So these fluids are dampness that's flowing through his body, this rheum. So to remove the disease, you have to dry out the spleen to overcome the dampness, but also he has to fill in this pit so that it will stop accumulating, so nothing can accumulate anymore. So the pit has to be filled in with earth, which is spleen, earth. So I stopped taking all the other herbs and I only took Cāngzhú. After 3 months, the condition was eliminated. So Cāngzhú. Okay, so these videos are really, I make them for practitioners and students. And so I assume that you have an idea about this herb. If you're just a person who hasn't studied Chinese medicine, of course you can enjoy the story, but I'm not going to explain things from the basics. And so Cāngzhú, of course, is an herb that goes to the spleen and it dries dampness pretty strongly. It supplements a little bit, but its main emphasis is drying dampness of the spleen. So after 3 months, the condition was eliminated. I continued taking the Cāngzhú for several years and there was no more vomiting. My chest felt relaxed and I could eat and drink just like before. During the summer, now I could sweat all over my body and then my body would cool off. That's normal. That's good. The rheum could now descend from the center. It was no longer stuck in a pit. Before the center is because spleen, stomach, earth is center. Before this, the rheum, though, had soaked into the liver, and so he attributed his eye problems to this as well. The liver opens in the eyes, so since the liver was messed up, his eyes were often dim or dazzled. In other words, he couldn't see, and he's like writing, so he needs to be able to see better. After he took the Cāngzhú, he was able to write small characters under lamplight. This was all due to the power of Cāngzhú. So here is what he did. And I will confess, I have some question about how this would exactly work, but here's my translation. First, peel off the skin of 1 jin of Cāngzhú. So it almost sounds like this is fresh, like just dug from the ground and not dried yet, but I'm not sure. He doesn't say. Back then, more often they would talk about processing the herbs in ways that, like if we bought them from the store, it's already done, but apparently people had to do themselves. So maybe he was using fresh Cāngzhú, chop it into very small pieces, and wet grind it in half a liang of unrefined sesame oil and 2 small cups of water. So these are not Western measuring cups, but this is some kind of cup that they would have in their kitchen. And I'm not really sure what it would look like at that time period. But oil and water and grinding the Cāngzhú in oil and water, then you want to filter it, and you're keeping the liquid and you're not keeping the powdered Cāngzhú. But of course, some of Cāngzhú will, its qi and flavor will go into that liquid. Then boil 15 dazao. I don't know if he used like hongzao or the black dates, but boil 15 dazao until they're soft. Remove the skin and their pit. And now grind them. Of course, again, this is like wet grinding because they're going to be wet from boiling and cooked. They're fruit, so they're going to be cooked and soft like applesauce. Then use a sesame oil liquid to further grind the dazao into a thin paste. Collect it in a mortar and thoroughly pestle it so it's really well mixed. And so like there are no like chunks, there are no little bits. It's really just a paste. Make it into pills the size of wutongzi and dry them. So this, he says a thin paste. So how are you making it into pills? It must not be that thin. And then wutongzi is this seed that I don't think it's really used in medicine, but pills size is often compared to it. This is going to be the size of those tiny little round pills that you buy with prepared medicine, from the Chinese pharmacy or wherever. Okay, so those are the pills. So these pills are made with date pulp. And that's kind of a weird thing, but actually, other pills, historically have been made with date pulp, including Sushen And if you want to read more about that, you could probably Bensky talks about it in his formulas book. So this isn't unique, although it's less common than other methods of making pills. In addition, incense was sometimes made with fruit pulp, like dazao or pear, like Asian pear. And this kind of incense is the type that's not burnt. It's the type that's heated and then releases a wonderful aroma. And so, there would be ground up herbs like sandalwood and, tanchang and chenshang ground up in a powder and then mixed with the pulp from the fruit, a whole formula of it, and then dried out enough. And then often it was aged. Even the jar would be buried in the earth for a period of time and to age it so the flavors, the aromas can meld with each other. And then it would be heated but not burnt. So this was a thing, making either incense or certain medicine pills with pulp of fruit. Not so common today. Okay, here's his directions. Every day, swallow 50 pills with salt water on an empty stomach. Increase up to 100 or 200 pills. While you're taking this medicine, avoid peaches and plums or sparrow and pigeon meat. So I guess peaches and plums are dampening and cooling, and so we're trying to dry out the spleen, and so that's why. I don't know about sparrow and pigeon meat. I'll be honest, I've never tried it, but probably that's like moist and dampening is probably why it's being prohibited. So now he tells his experience after he's taking this. When I first started taking Cāngzhú, my diaphragm became slightly dry in an unpleasant way. What does that mean? It might mean he had difficulty swallowing. In Chinese medicine, the diaphragm does have a lot to do with swallowing. If there's a blockage at the diaphragm, then people will choke when they try to swallow food, or they might vomit after, like when the food goes down, it can't get through the diaphragm, so they vomit it back up like instantly after eating. I don't really know what symptom he had, but his diaphragm was slightly dry. And so he took Maozhu, which is Cāngzhú from Maoshan, which is a famous mountain in China. And it's considered the highest quality of Cāngzhú. So instead of taking the crappy stuff that you could buy for cheap, he was taking the best quality when he felt it was too drying. And if the dryness felt severe, then he'd take a dose of San. I'll have a slide about that. And then it would not feel dry for a long time. Ooh, my phone's ringing. Sorry. Okay. I should have turned it off. Okay. So he'd take this San, which Jurza is pretty cold and bitter. Anyway, after taking Cāngzhú for half a year, then he didn't have to use the expensive stuff anymore. Then he could only needed to use the dry, fierce, very acrid, everyday kind. And he'd peel the skin, but he didn't soak it. This was very powerful, and he no longer felt the dryness after this period of time, even without doing anything else like taking the San. So here's his description of San. It's just made from Jurza, which is the seed of gardenia flower, dried and powdered. It's going to be really bitter and cold. So it'll counteract the Cāngzhú. And then, you just have a powder of this and pour boiling water on it and then drink it. So he says, this is how I realized that you shouldn't sit for a long time leaning to one side. Probably you just shouldn't sit for a long time. Also, you should move around and take a break every now and then. This advice is things that we're being told today, that it's so detrimental to sit all day at the computer. You should get up every so often and walk around and move about and take a break and let your eyes relax. So anyway, that's his story. That's his case. And so, yeah, thanks for listening if you got all the way here.